It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day and welcome, listeners, to the Two Jacks. And we'd love to bring you a show today, but nothing actually happened in the world in the last week. And no, it actually has. Quite a lot has happened. And joining me to discuss it all is Hong Kong Jack, who's got a bit of a lurgy today, mate, possibly COVID.
Well, who knows? A lot of people getting COVID around here and even more on the mainland. I tell you what, I was watching The Drum last night. I know it's your favourite show.
Oh, it's a wonderful show.
And they were talking to their movie expert about the Oscars.
Oh, yeah.
And he was waxing lyrical about one particular movie, and he says that the director did a great job. He made use of the visual medium. And I thought, well, it is a film.
Well, there, you know, that's kind of one of those KPIs, isn't it, Jack?
Yeah.
When you make a film, you make it in a visual forum, visual platform. Yeah. And look, kicking us off today, just across the drink from you in China, Jack, the President Xi has had his third term confirmed by the National People's Congress.
Yeah, this is the government part of the government, if you like. It's the least important part, really. His title that really matters is not that he's president; it's that he's General Secretary of the Communist Party.
Yes, that's the most important thing. But the National People's Congress, I think, has, you need a big room to fit them all in, don't you?
Yeah, I couldn't count them last night. I saw it on the telly.
There was quite a few people there. President Xi said, security is the bedrock of development, while stability is a prerequisite for prosperity. Sounds a little bit contrary to what the Sydney Morning Herald has been running over the last week. Did you catch any of that, Jack, by the way?
I saw a little bit of it, yes.
What do you make of it? I mean, it just seems to be unnecessarily provocative and a little bit scary. If you're perhaps a little bit suggestible, as I'd suggest some of the Sydney Morning Herald readers are.
I would have come to the same conclusion. Yes.
Yeah, I just don't think that's necessary. Media Watch sort of ripped it apart because they didn't. The so-called panel of experts are all. It was a bit of an agree-a-thon. Including one particular member who's been suggesting war with China was months away, and he said that years ago.
So it was a bit like the ABC, was it? Everyone agreeing with everybody else?
Everybody agreeing. Peter Harcher put together a team that would agree with him. He's a long-standing critic of China and a fellow who believes that China's strategic interests will, at some point, very, 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 very soon, allow a sort of military-style invasion of Australia. I don't want to sound flippant about it, but really, I don't know. There's a lot of understanding going on about China's interests. You know, when we look at South China Sea and the build-up of their naval fleet, a lot of it is designed. Peter Harcher might be paranoid about China, but the Chinese government tend to be paranoid particularly about the US and keeping their shipping lanes open. That a blockade would cause incredible harm to China. So that's when I look at these sorts of things like the South China Sea. I don't agree with them, by the way. You can see, if you look at it from a different point of view, you can see China's strategic interest is about keeping that country supplied with food and everything else it needs.
Personally, I think the China hawks get China wrong, as do the champions of China in Australia. You know, your Paul Keatings and your Bob Carrs, they get it wrong as well.
Okay. All right. Well, what does this mean now? Does it have any consequences? This is the grand meeting of the National People's Congress. What does that have any impact on Hong Kong, Jack?
President Xi Jinping was talking up Hong Kong and Macau, wants them to be prosperous and secure and stable.
Well, that sounds perfectly reasonable. Now, in the meantime, Jack, coming back to our own shores, there's been a bit of a barney about The Voice with Brett Walker, probably our most well-known. I think he takes the term KC now, doesn't he?
I think so,
rather than SC. No, it doesn't really matter. Brett Walker, it must be said, has made more appearances to the Australian High Court than any other KC or council in Australia. And he made I think he addressed a meeting at his firm, where he outlined his criticism of those who are sort of supporting the no vote, describing it as a bit racist, specifically describing the description of The Voice as a third chamber of parliament as being grounded in racism, Jack. And this brought the ire of Louise Clegg, who's another prominent barrister in Sydney, and also the wife of Angus Taylor, who's the shadow spokesman for, I can't think, Jack. What portfolios hasn't he stuffed up?
Is he shadow treasurer or something?
No, he's not shadow treasurer. God knows they wouldn't let him anywhere near any money. But I think he might be a shadow energy minister, but I could be wrong about that. But anyway, yes. What did you make of that, Barney?
I read Brett Walker's speech. It was at Clayton Newt's a
That's
major
right,
law
it was too, yeah.
For a very, very smart fella, it wasn't all that logical.
All right, yes, and it did grab the ire, I think. Look, one of the things I think we need to avoid in this discussion about The Voice, and there will be some heated discussion at times, is that we want to avoid allegations of racism, don't we? I mean, the no vote is mired, for example, in racism. I think that's a sort of pointless argument to make, and potentially harmful to the yes push.
I think it is. I think it's a losing move.
All right. Well, Marcia Langton had something to say too about, and she sort of said, well, let's just go to the courts. If you need to sort it out, let's go to the courts. That's not terribly sensible either, is it? You want to actually get the legislation right, don't you?
Yeah. My view of the Voice is, I said it was about a 40% chance of success last week. It's probably gone down about 5 points since then.
There you go. All right, yes, there will be more and more criticism of The Voice. We're still waiting for a clear question from the advisory panel, and that will really sort of kick off a bit more debate. But yeah, calling the no votes racist, I'm sure some of them in the lower echelons of this debate might be, but the people who are arguing the case, it really serves no purpose. Now, Jack, have you got a lazy?
You look at people like Louise Clegg and Frank Brennan, who are troubled by aspects of the current proposal. If you start calling either of them racist, you really are losing the debate.
Yeah, all right, I totally agree with that. Have you got a lazy 300 billion lying around, Jack?
I had a look under the couch cushions and I couldn't find it.
Well, that is the estimated cost of Australia's new purchase of mainly US, but I think one UK nuclear sub. It's being hailed, certainly in the reading that I've done in the Australia, it's been hailed as a big step forward, a major strategic initiative. The first of the subs will roll off the assembly plan. The nuclear subs will roll off, I think, as an estimated 2033. But in the meantime, as soon as 2024-25, there will be nuclear subs, US nuclear subs, and one UK nuclear sub arriving in our ports, Jack.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister dusted off the old cliche, it's a new dawn.
It's a new dawn. Yeah, it's new dawn. Well, it is very, very significant in terms of our strategic capabilities. Probably worthwhile just explaining why submarines are so valuable. they can basically lurk around. They are intended like Australia's Air Force capacity. It's basically provides a first strike capability or a second response capability of great lethality. That is, basically, these new subs will not contain nuclear arms, but they will contain the ability. To launch cruise missiles as well as torpedoes to strike naval forces on the sea. It does very much change the way we will be looked at by the world. It also draws us much, much closer to the United States, Jack. Is that a good thing? Paul Keating says no.
I don't think it's a bad thing.
Well, yes, help us out. Go on, tell me more.
I just think this is going to take a long time to come to fruition, and I've got no objection to the decision. Is how I would put it. I'm not a cheerleader for it, but nor am I an opponent for it.
Yeah. So when we bought the Joint Strike Fighter, Jack, the Indonesians became a little bit upset, for example, because the Chinese will be upset about this, and we're going to have to manage that. Yeah, I think that's the important thing. That this, what you're selling is a first strike capability as a defensive capability, and that's why the Indonesians got a little bit upset, because you've got the ability to strike into Southeast Asia, obviously Indonesia. With the Joint Strike Fighter, which is basically, well, I think if it all works, a high tech fighter that will.
But our F-111s had a capacity to strike into Indonesia as well.
Yeah, that's right. But these in that ongoing sort of a balance of who has the stronger capability, the Joint Strike Fighter completely outguns, if you like, the Indonesian Air Force, for example, who are essentially relying on MiGs. They've been buying MiGs, Soviet fighters, for a very long time, haven't they?
Yeah, well, they've got, on the other side of Indonesia, they have Singapore as a small but formidable air force there.
Where are they getting their gear from, mate? Is that a British gear, US?
No, it's a bit of everywhere, but they've got Hornets and all that sort of stuff. American fighters. I mean, if you're in Singapore, there's always one taking off and landing and working around the island.
There's one sort of story that's gone largely unreported, of course. The whole business of the subs began with a deal with a French munitions company to build, I think it was 6 non-nuclear powered. That's not the right term, but not conventionally powered submarines.
Yeah.
And this involved, and now this involves paying that company a significant amount of money, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
I think somewhere the compensation runs at about $6 billion for essentially nothing.
I can tell you that I checked Pearls and Irritations this morning, which is the student newsletter for retired public servants and Jack Waterford, the Canberra Times journalist, and they're not happy. Not happy? No.
What's their problem with this?
Various takes, but they're not going to. But you wouldn't expect them to be happy. As I said, since they've retired from the civil service, they've gone back to their student politician days, and they're opposed to the US entirely.
That's the point I'm trying to make. That there is still a profound anti-US sentiment in this country. And this really does bring Australia's strategic interests very much in line. AUKUS is ANZUS writ large without New Zealand in it, and really just does. There will be issues because US nuclear powered submarines contain nuclear weapons, as I'm sure the British do, and they will be landing in our ports. There's nothing really different about that, by the way. and it's always been
they've been doing port visits anyway.
Yeah. Well, we get very excited when the big when the big Abraham Lincoln the big boat from the States comes to visit, and that is loaded to the gunnels with nuclear weapons, and the US always does the don't ask, don't tell thing. Of course, this led to basically the withdrawal of New Zealand from the AUKUS treaty. And I think they're still begging to get back in, aren't they, Jack?
Well, I don't know. At any event, they've given up on providing for their own defence. They're just relying on their friends to look after them if it comes to that.
I think it's a geographic defence. It's a long way away from anywhere.
Yeah. And there's not much there when you get there.
That's right. A lot of strategic value once you take it over. And speaking of the United States, Jack, Tucker Carlson. You don't know what he's thinking, do you? It depends. You need to read his texts, and then you need to see what he's on the television.
Well,
and
it
doesn't seem to be any sort of divergence there. He did run a show where he ran the January 6 tapes, which included a bit of an invitation almost for the Q shaman to enter into the building. It was very misleading. The footage itself had come from the House Speaker.
Yes, there's 40,000 hours, I think, isn't there, of closed circuit camera footage.
Yeah, we didn't see the full 40,000. We only saw a few minutes of it. I mean, how can Tucker Carlson? Let's start with this. How can Tucker Carlson be taken seriously when texts that have been released in regard to this Dominion voting systems a lawsuit against News Corp and Fox News, not News Corp. It indicates that Carlson was saying Trump was a lunatic. The electoral fraud stuff was just all nonsense. And he believed that at the time. And then he get up on the show that evening and go, "It's terrible what's happening. There's been electoral fraud."
Well, he wouldn't be the first journalist who's ever done that.
Well, he's certainly not the first at Fox News. There's two or three of them there. Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham as well. I've never seen it so well laid out. That his private musings are so diametrically opposed to his on-air musings. Yeah,
I'm not all that interested in whether he's a good person or a bad person. I don't think the show he put out actually showed that anyone hadn't committed crimes which they've been convicted.
Duly convicted of, yes. Some of them sentenced to long jail terms.
Except that there is one chance that the shaman fellow might get off, and perhaps some other people might get off, is if their counsel were not shown the exculpatory evidence, were not given access to it, and the prosecution had it, that would be grounds to dismiss the charges.
Very interesting case of the Q shaman, Jack. He actually wrote to and sought public support from Donald Trump. He actually sought a pardon, which was...
He actually pled guilty, of course.
Yeah, he did, which was duly ignored. He did plead guilty because that was what we might call a plea bargain. He was looking at a fair old stretch. I think he's doing 4 years off the top of my head.
Yeah,
he will only eat organic food, Jack, and that's his mother sought the support of the courts to bring food into him. That was while he was remanded, essentially. I'm not sure how he's going now. The American prison system, food there it's essentially like a cheap form of McDonald's. That's probably not the right way. A very cheap sort of fast food stuff, and the poor old Q shaman who's been raised on organic food has to chow down on a junior cheeseburger every night.
Yeah, the solution to that just screams at me. Just tell him it's organic.
You put a stamp on the burger.
Yeah.
put a flag on it. Yeah, okay. So it is an interesting one because some of this footage was not made available. He did, in fact, plead guilty, which doesn't give him a lot of wiggle room, though. Does it?
The real question is, why was access to the 40,000 hours of this footage just given to one journalist, or in fact, he's an opinion columnist, and why it wasn't given to everybody, and why it wasn't given to everybody years ago?
So what are we going to call it, Jack? Was it an insurrection, or was it just a full-scale riot? Because I've always called it a riot. Attempted insurrection.
It looked like a riot to me.
It was, in fact, a riotous affair, and a number of Congress people have come forward since to talk about their experience on that day, including a number of Republicans who said, "Yeah, look, it was nasty," and they felt for their lives. All right, well. McCarthy's released a video, as I say, but giving it to Carlson is a bit odd. I think that's the point you were making, Jack.
Well, I would. First of all, Nancy Pelosi should have handed it out years ago, or provided access to it, and McCarthy equally is at fault because he only gave it to one person. He should have given it to the news reporters, all of them.
All right, yeah, okay. Now to some Democrat polling, Jack, for the 2024 run, and
this is the alternate.
This is
contenders.
the others, yeah. Everyone but Joe.
Yeah. So it runs like this: Kamala Harris 27%, Buttigieg, Pete the Mayor Buttigieg 14%, Elizabeth Warren 8%. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez 6%, Newsom 6%, despite his fabulous hair, Amy Klobuchar 5%, and the rest of them you won't have heard of, pretty much. And that goes to tell you, I looked at that list and said, Joe's going to be the nominee.
Oh, well, look, the basic rule of thumb is a sitting president says, I'm running again, that's the end of it. There's no primary.
Well, except if there's a credible alternative, and you look at that list and there isn't.
Yeah, look, my tip, my alternate tip for Amy Klobuchar, because of her credentials as a kind of centre left, but also has strong support within the Midwest. She's not looking all that flashy.
That's the trouble. Yeah,
not looking all that. Then you've got Kamala at 27% is leading the pack, and you've got to say, well, Joe, if he remains fit, should be the nominee, or should just go straight through. In that, it raises the issue, doesn't it? I mean, Joe, I think he's just turned 80, hasn't he? And I'll just check his age, but he's no spring chicken, and then we look across the place. He just turned 80 in November last year. If we look across the place, you've got some very old people, of course. Mitch McConnell had a fall and was concussed. I think he's just back at work now. It's almost like an aged care home. You've got Biden at 80, as we say. Nancy Pelosi 82. Maxine Waters is 83. Chuck Grassley is 88. Dianne Feinstein, if she can remember, is 89. Klaus Schwab is 84. George Soros is 94. That surprised me a little bit. I didn't think he was as old as that, Jack. But yeah, we have got a bit of this is something that Elon Musk has tweeted up too, by the way. But he hasn't had a huge week himself, so maybe wait for age isn't the best way of looking at things.
Yeah.
That's
Elon very different to Australia. We tend to push them off into the pasture long before that.
Well, I think there's something to be said. So certainly, if High Court judge is 70, isn't it?
72.
72. I think that makes sense. I mean, I've never understood why the SCOTUS in the United States allows people just to, they can retire, of course, but if they're not of that mentality, they can hang around there until 100 years of age. That doesn't make any sense to me.
That used to be the rule in Australia until I think the mid 70s.
I think it was another Whitlam reform. I'm fairly
one of the
sure.
few referendums that have passed that was reducing the age of judges to 72. Before that, they could do it for life. What was his name?
Well, that might have been it.
Justice McTiernan, who was served till a very great age, and most of his judgments in his later years simply said, "I concur."
And I think I got that wrong. It wasn't a Whitlam reform or referendum. It was done by Fraser's AG Ellicott. I think that might be right. Okay. Look, Jack, we might have just a bit of a glimpse into the 1930s here, with what's going on with minor banks, led by the Silicon Valley Bank, which is having a major problem in terms of its liquidity. The US government has come out, the Biden administration has come out and saying that they will provide guarantees around the Silicon Valley Bank, but the Wall Street figures from this day show absolute smashing for the banks generally and the small banks in particular. So what's going wrong with the Silicon Valley Bank, Jack?
The regional bank situation in the United States is quite different to Australia. There are a lot of regional banks in the US, and they hold a lot of money, and they're down yesterday 60%, and the major banks were down 5 to 8%. So it's carnage on Wall Street in that respect.
It was carnage, yeah. I've been doing a little bit of reading about this, and people are suggesting that the cause of this is the US inflation rate.
Yes, almost certainly. Well, that's an approximate cause. What the higher US inflation rate has done has reduced the market price of the bonds, the long-term bonds that the bank was holding. There's a newsletter. I haven't actually read the whole newsletter, so I won't name it, but he was suggesting a couple of months ago that SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, was leveraged 185 to 1 on assets, including the long-term bonds and such gems as industry premium, premium wine holdings and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
And what happened is that as things have gotten a bit hard in the tech, they are very heavy on tech investors. As things have gotten tough in the tech world, people have started to pull their deposits out.
Yes.
And that meant that they had to look to how to cover those deposits, and that meant they had to mark to market, that is, market the current price, the long-term bonds they were holding, and their prices well down because of the inflation rate. And they didn't have the cash to follow it. Couldn't have the cash to pay that.
Did you say 185 to 1? Is that Prudential funds, that sort of thing? 185 to 1.
So this, I haven't been able to verify that. I only read it late last night or early this morning. Look,
I mean, look, if you were a customer of the SVB, that's the Silicon Valley Bank, Jack, what do you do? Do you go into the bank and say, no, I don't want the office furniture. Can you? I need the hard cash. Is it going to be? Look, as I said, the Biden administration has guaranteed deposits, which might calm things down a bit. But it looks like this bank, well, it may not make it, Jack.
Very early days and a lot to play out there, I think.
Very serious situation and reminiscent, and everyone is talking about it. Every report you read says the largest bank failure since the Great Recession.
Yeah, well, it's actually two banks they've taken over. The other one's a New York-based bank called Signature Bank, which amusingly has the former Massachusetts Congressman Barney Frank, the author of the Dodd-Frank legislation, on its board.
And it's the other thing, Jack. There are actually, I think, 3 signature banks. So there are 2 signature banks who've had to come forward and say it's not us, and come out with some press statements that said, please don't cause a run here. Yeah, biggest since the Great Recession. Some of the reporting has gone way back into the 1930s when there was a huge run on the banks and banking did collapse. But yes, this is the first we've seen since the Great Recession. That's what the Americans call and sometimes it's called the Northern Hemisphere failure, but this is the failure of markets around the world, 2007, 2008.
Yeah, Twitter's been going nuts about the fact that Silicon Valley Bank was a very woke bank. They were very heavy on the DEI and ESG, etc., and people have been having a great deal of fun with that.
Were they? Were they though? A little bit.
They were.
A little bit, yeah, okay.
Yeah. They didn't have a risk. They didn't have a risk manager for some months last year, but they had plenty of DEI personnel.
Right, so you do need to have that risk assessor on the premises. Goldman Sachs have been involved, Jack.
Well, they were trying to put together a deal to buy it at $95, I think, on last Thursday, and they couldn't get it done overnight, which is probably just as well because it was worth about nothing the next day.
I was going to say it'd be worth a bit less than 95 now. All right, so one to watch, and when banks collapse, it generally is a bit of a sign that economic times are not that solid. This one seems to be driven at its heart. There will be specifics around that. There'll be specific, perhaps, management failures, etc., around SVB. But the inflation rate in the United States is the major drama of that particular calamity. All right, so just scrolling forward here. Oh, I'm sorry. It's just yes. Look, we just want to talk right now about Trump and his indictment. You reckon he'll never go? You reckon he's as slippery as an eel and will never get pinged? But it looks like there's a very strong chance that he will be indicted in New York, Jack. Yeah,
I'd be surprised if he was, but I've been surprised before.
Yeah, and this relates to the payment to Stormy Daniels, a porn actress that he says he had no relationship, sexual or otherwise, with, and came out on his Truth Socials to say actually denigrated the woman. Basically said, "Oh, a man of my fine looks wouldn't waste his time with her." But they
he's
do
have class, isn't he?
Yeah. He just knows how to sink the slipper. That's what he's doing. But this relates to his former attorney, who's now been summoned to the grand jury. I believe gave evidence to the grand jury. His former personal lawyer arranging a payment of some millions of dollars to Stormy Daniels, sort of shut up money. But it has come from campaign funds, and that's where the illegality lies, Jack, or the alleged illegality lies. And of course, his former lawyer, what's his name? The fellow there, he did a bit of jail time himself, and then spent because of COVID, spent the rest of it with an ankle bracelet on. His lawyer is gleefully giving evidence against him. Wouldn't need to be subpoenaed. He'd be waiting. He'd be waiting in the hallway with some papers in his hand, ready to go. All right. Iran and Saudi Arabia to reopen their embassies. That's a good move, isn't it, Jack? So these are the two powerhouses of the Middle East. One is Sunni, that's the Saudis. The other is Shia, that's the Iranians. And they've reopened embassies in both of their capitals now, in Tehran and Riyadh, isn't it?
It's probably good news for the Yemenis, where in Yemen Iran and Saudi have been waging a proxy war, if you like, with supporting different factions in Yemen. But personally, I don't think it's bad news for everybody else in the Middle East.
Why so? Can't it be good these two powerhouses at least have diplomatic lines of communication open?
No. Iran needs to be contained for the sake of the rest of the Middle East.
Well, what about the Saudis? How come they get off scot-free every time with their human rights abuses? I mean, it's a terrible, terrible regime. How come they keep skating
I don't
away?
I don't think they should, and nor do they. But they're nowhere near as bad as the Iranians. Sometimes it's a matter of which of these people are the worst.
But that's surely not how you can bring about peace in the Middle East. The Saudis are still filthy with the Americans for the invasion of Iran. I've got this Iran War 2, Jack, because they realised, unlike the Americans, that toppling Saddam would necessarily mean the Shiite majority in Iran would take control of the country. And basically southern Iran, I'm getting confused. Southern Iraq is essentially a satellite of Iran now.
Yep.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't see this as a bad thing. China put the deal together, didn't they?
Yeah, it was signed in Beijing.
Okay. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but look, we, you and I are both opposed to both regimes. I don't think there's any value at all in the US in particular, and Australia sells a lot of bushrangers to the Saudis, Jack.
I think we do.
But I don't think there's any point in picking one over the other. They're both as bad as each other. That's where the next Middle East conflict comes from, isn't it, really? If it's not managed properly, that's where the next big conflagration in the Middle East can occur. Saudis versus the Iranians. They've been involved in proxy wars for as long as you mentioned. Yeah, yes, Yemen, but also in Iraq, also in Lebanon. That's been going for a while. All right, now, Jack, we've got to get into this. This is the UK and their new policy on turning back boat arrivals.
Just before we go there, I saw something this morning that I haven't had a chance to raise with you before. Support for Scottish independence has fallen to 39%.
I would expect so, with Sir Sturgeon resigning and the unlikelihood of a referendum. I mean, if someone came forward, and it won't happen in the foreseeable
I think
future.
it actually tells us something else. It tells us what a formidable politician Nicola Sturgeon was.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, that's a very good point to make.
That without her, the thing's collapsing.
Yeah. Look, it could kick up again at any time.
Yeah.
But
the Scottish National Party has all sorts of weird and wonderful people in it, with no real core set of values. And without her to weld the thing together, the thing's just collapsing. None of the three potential candidates to be her replacement look the least bit likely to be able to pull off independence.
Well, all three of them have basically knocked it back.
Yeah.
And it's not viable because the referendum, just to explain to listeners, if there was to be a referendum, it would need to be cleared in the UK Parliament. It would need to be cleared through the Commons and the House of Lords first, and that seems very, very unlikely.
Yeah.
So we'll get to that now. So you've talked about a little bit there for some time now that the issue is boat arrivals, illegal arrivals, shall we call them? And I don't like that term, but and that was a political problem the Tories needed to solve in order to become vaguely electable.
Yeah, unauthorised arrivals they were called in Australia, I think, from memory.
All right, there's so much to unpack here, Jack, isn't there? Not least of all that a certain certain soccer presenter and a very fine soccer player in his time, Gary Lineker, is fallen foul of the BBC. We'll get to that in a moment. But what is actually being proposed by the Sunak government here, Jack? They're talking about small boat interceptions, aren't they?
They are. And exactly how they're going to do that, they haven't disclosed, and nor should they. What they're talking about, though, is if you arrive unauthorised, you will not be eligible for long-term settlement in Britain, becoming a permanent resident, becoming a citizen.
And therefore, you'll be either sent back to your country of origin or where that's not safe. And we'll get to the nature of these sort of small boat arrivals in a minute. And when that's not safe, they'll be shipped off to Rwanda, which is currently not accepting rejected refugees from the UK due to a number of court challenges.
Or in the case of Albanians, say, being sent back to Albania. They have a return agreement.
Yeah, they have with Albania as well. The small boat arrivals, Jack, as I'm told, are essentially Afghan refugees, Jack.
No, that's not the information I've seen.
Well, I was reading it may well not be accurate, but this is from a human rights group, and they're saying that the majority of them are Afghan refugees. You might have a different view, a different understanding of that, and of course, the Taliban is kicking off there. We'll get to the Lineker business in a minute, but Suella Braverman, the Home Affairs Secretary or Minister, I should say, she said, Jack, rather inflammatory sort of remarks, that there are 100 million externally displaced persons in the world, and they are coming here. Now, the UK received refugee applicants to the tune of 89,000. There's a big difference there between 89,000 and 100 million, isn't there?
Perhaps she was away the week they did maths.
She seems to be. She's a rather controversial minister. Has been for some time. She's also bringing in a basically freedom of speech codicil for the police, which is very interesting, given her remarks about. She's
a political warrior. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, she's definitely from the right. She's been Home Affairs Minister. She had to resign about a year ago after it was discovered she used a private email account to send off official documents to a colleague. But
the reason this is a potential move to deal the Tories back into at least a competitive position is that a clear majority of the United Kingdom citizens don't want the boat arrivals across the Channel, and that puts Labor in a difficult position because almost all the Labor Party are sort of open borders people.
Yeah, so, but the problem will be, Jack, I understand the politics behind it, but the problem will be coming up with a plan that works, and coming up with a plan that won't shift public opinion. Because one thing we've learned from this Conservative government, and regardless of which manifestation, whether it was a Johnson one or whether it was his predecessor or indeed his successor, short-lived as she was, and now Sunak, is that they tend to make huge mistakes in terms of public administration, and that's the way this may well flip. Now, look, I know what you're saying. Basically, the proposition of Brexit was put forward to Great Britons. I wouldn't say the same of the Scots or the Northern Irish, and it was put forward to them on the basis of race. And so you can understand how some people who've probably never seen a refugee in their life have a terrible fear about them. And that's why I get to Suella Braverman's comments about 100 million people coming here. It's the truth of the matter is that the UK receives half half of what the French accept in terms of refugees, and in terms of an acceptance of refugees compared with the rest of Europe, they sit very much in the middle rungs of those
I don't
40
think
nations.
this has got much to do with race. This is essentially a rule of law issue. The reason all around the world this is the case, the reason people don't like open borders policies is they believe there's a proper process and everyone should have to go through that process. That you can't just stroll across the border or hop on an inflatable and drive across the channel. I'm sure there's a racial element to it, but the biggest thing is they don't like the breaking of the rules.
Understand, but I'll just get back to the point. If the preponderance of these people on small boats crossing the channel are in fact Afghan refugees,
I think that's not right.
we'll see. And if the preponderance of them is that, and so we've got to ask a question: why would you, if you're a refugee escaping, let's say, Syria or Afghanistan, why would you want to go to the UK? I mean, if you looked at their economic stats, I don't want to go anywhere near that place.
When you're already in France, don't forget.
Well, they're talking about people who have travelled through, like the UK is this sort of pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But that's absolute nonsense because most other countries are accepting higher numbers.
Well,
if they are travelling through, they are travelling through for a reason, and that reason would be that they have familial contacts in the UK, that they may have associates that they've made, particularly if they're Afghan people who have come across that they had established relationships with British service people and so forth. That might be another reason. But it's not as if, and this is what I get really annoyed about with Braverman's comments, that it's not as if, everyone is, that the UK is this bright, shining artifice of democracy and easy living, when that clearly isn't the case for a start on economic grounds, but also the fact that that it is the chosen spot where they would settle, and I find that a bit offensive, and I think and it's unnecessarily creating problems, particularly problems of race and ethnicity within the UK now.
I don't think it is. Again, I don't think it's a question of race at all, or a very small part of it's race. It's really a question of are you going to follow the rules or are you not going to follow the rules? This is the same all around the world. It was the same in Australia, certainly the same in the United States. I know the progressive left think this is wrong, but they've never, ever persuaded a majority of people to agree with them anywhere.
No boat intercepts on the Rio Grande, mate. I mean, we've done it here, but our geographic circumstances, for good or ill, have allowed that to work substantially well. The current policy, by the way, Christmas Island is closed. There are still a small number of refugees in the route. I think Manus Island is all but closed, if it's not closed. Is basically if you arrive here, you're just sent back home and put you on a plane back home.
Mm.
And that works, I guess, if you're Sri Lankan. It doesn't work so well if you're from Afghanistan or Syria.
Yeah, the Indonesians told us for years, you have to take the sugar off the table.
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is that the sugar's not on the table in the UK. What I'm saying is that
in one important sense it is. Almost everybody wins their asylum case in the UK because of the way the courts work. That doesn't happen in Germany and France.
There's a huge backlog of these cases, so there are problems within the immigration department
and
well.
Like in Australia, a huge backlog's very good for the applicants because you're never going to get sent back.
Yeah, but that means that they just don't have the bureaucratic weight there. And yes, they're one of their sources. I talked about, we mentioned Rwanda. That's currently clogged in the courts. I read one story from a refugee now settled in France, Jack. He made his way to the UK. They sent him back to Rwanda in the very, very early days of this transmission. He stayed in, there was a residential sort of compound for him. He's there for a couple of days, and then someone said, get on the bus, and they drove him out to the Ugandan border and said, "Get out, off you go." And he traversed his way. You've got to give him credit for this. He traversed his way all through Eastern Africa, all the way up through Central Africa. God only knows how, and then made his way to France again. Rwanda doesn't seem to be a real problem. I'd also add that the EU has said that this plan, and I know you're not a fan of the EU, but the EU has said that this plan contravenes international law.
Yeah, I don't know whether the Tories can pull this off, but if they can, it deals them back into the election. And most importantly, it's what the majority of the people want if it can be done. And as I say, the progressives can rail against this and carry on, but they've never, ever persuaded a majority of the people to agree with it.
All right, well, we'll see, because Gary Lineker, a highly regarded footballer from days of yore, used to play for Leicester, used to play for Everton, also played for Tottenham Hotspurs, and one of the very rare homegrown Brit footballers who went to Barcelona and done good. Very fine player at Barcelona. I think 80 test caps for the UK, and the fourth highest, for England, and the fourth highest goal scorer for England, and has been a host of the match of the day for 20 plus years.
He's the BBC's highest paid employee.
Yeah, £1.35 million is his estimated salary. Worth every cent of it, mate, because we saw that he made a remark. The remark I do have a few problems with. He likened Sarah Braverman's, we just talked about her 100 million people all coming here, she didn't say all, she said coming here. He likened that language to that of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, which is no doubt a bit of hyperbole. But of course, Lineker works for the BBC, and the BBC insist on impartiality. Why they insist on impartiality from a football show presenter?
Can I just correct you there? Can I just correct you there? The BBC insists on the appearance of impartiality.
Well, yeah, right. Well, they did in this case, and then they said, "Well, it's okay, Gary. We'll sort this out with a quick apology." And he said, "I'm not going to apologise." Well, Lineker, just to be clear, has supported refugees. I believe he adopted a couple, or at least housed a couple of refugees in his own home, and feels very, very strongly about this issue. Refused to apologise, and so they stood him down for one game. I also have to say that
for one weekend, yes.
Yeah, one weekend. I also have to say that the immigration minister, great genius that he is, Robin Jenrick, said in a television program that Gary Lineker needs to be shown a red card, Jack. And that means, what does that mean? That means suspension, doesn't it?
Yeah,
that means silencing, doesn't it?
You go for an early shower.
That means cancel culture, doesn't it, Jack? What really strikes me about this is that a week or two ago, people like Braverman and Jenrick were saying, it is terrible what we're doing with Roald Dahl. It is terrible how we're getting so woke. It is terrible that this cancel culture is being practiced. And then they go around and do it themselves.
He has been reinstated, I believe. I think it's all over.
I think that happened, today. It's just happened today. He's been reinstated, and I don't know what he's going to do. Of course, his co-compares, or his they call them pundits, on the panel, people like Ian Wright, said, well, we're not going to work either. So the 1.5 hour show went for 20 minutes with just a few packages of highlights and apologies from the BBC. I know Piers Morgan said, look, if you're not reporting on political matters, it doesn't matter. If you're in the BBC and you're not reporting on political matters, well, you should be allowed to tweet whatever you want to tweet.
Yeah, well, I'm a bit of a believer to let them tweet whatever they want to tweet anyway. But I can see why you don't want your news reporters to be airing their opinions on Twitter.
I can see that.
Yeah, but but all your political pundits and all that sort of stuff, I've got no objection to them being on Twitter and letting us know what they think. I think it's actually a useful exercise. I mean, for starters, we can see since Twitter started, we can see what a monoculture the ABC in Australia is. All you've got to do is run through the Twitter feeds of the people who were the prominent ABC voices, and with a few notable exceptions, they're all the same.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't be so sweeping with that. And having had some experience of working inside the ABC, I can say that being in it is a lot harder than being out of it. It was not a pleasant experience. But the thing that grabs me about the Lineker blow up is the hypocrisy of it. And I had a bit of a chat with a nice bloke who calls himself from the centre right on Twitter about this, and he said, well, you know, the left would be screaming louder and all that sort of stuff. And I said, mate, and this is something we've discussed. I said, the right have always been banning books. The right have always been banning elements of free speech they don't like. He asked me for some examples, and I gave him one of Portnoy's complaint, which takes us back to the 70s. That there was a banned book in Australia, and I said, conservatives, for some reason, they are terrified at the prospect of a horny public, and they will impose themselves all the way. The difference now is that the left has become as censorious as the right has always been, and that leads to this sort of new Puritanism in our society.
Yeah, well, my view of it is I had no problems with Lineker tweeting that, but then I had no problems with Israel Folau tweeting what he tweeted either. You know,
well, that's just it. You know, if you're a minister of the Crown of the UK, if you're a Braverman or Janet, then how do you deal with a comment like Gary Lineker's? Well, you don't say, I think he should be cancelled. I think he should be suspended. I think he should be
say you don't agree with it.
You say,
if you don't agree with
this is, yeah. You say, look, that's hyperbole. He's got that wrong. And while I respect his views, he's actually wrong on this count, and this is why he's wrong. So that's how you do it, right?
Well, I wouldn't even do that. I would come straight out fighting if I was them and say, look, whenever you raise the spectre of we're all like Nazi Germany, you've just lost the argument.
That's a good point. Well, look, it didn't occur, it would seem, to Suella Braverman, who said, my children are directly descended from people who were murdered in gas chambers during the Holocaust. To kind of throw out this kind of flippant analogies diminishes the unspeakable tragedy that millions of people went through, and I don't think anything that is happening in the UK today can come close to what happened in the Holocaust. Yeah. Well, she sort of makes that point, I suppose, that you just said. She's married to a Jewish fellow, of course. Commons leader Penny Mordaunt, this is a beauty, accused Labor of borrowing from the Gary Lineker playbook by being the party of goal hangers. And Lineker responded, hit back at her clumsy analogy, and that's a quote, saying he was just happy to have been in the 6-yard box. He was just happy to have been better in the 6-yard box than you are at the dispatch box. Oh,
that's not bad.
Give that man a seat.
This actually dates back to a criticism that was often made of Lineker when he played, that he hung around the 6-yard box, and a hell of a lot of the goals he scored for England were just tap-ins when someone else did all the work. So that's the historic reason for that. Look, the BBC actually got it right by giving him his job back, and there's a lesson there for the Australian Rugby Union. That's what they should have done. They should have said, no, Israel's playing.
Yeah. Look, this is precisely the point I'm making. The cancel culture, which is summoned up by the left and summoned up by the right when it suits them, it certainly exists, but the stuff that can be offensive to the left, it just ignores that cancel culture, and similarly on the other side. I mean, this is the junk, and this is the junk of it, and we're just leading ourselves into a sort of new, sort of sterile forms of expression. The way to handle things that cause offence is to come back and be just as offensive. That's the way it's got to be dealt with. You hold arguments.
To some of us, that comes natural.
Yeah, I've been doing it for a long time. It must be just said, but I don't think it's any great significance that the numbers of viewers for the truncated version of Match of the Day actually rose. But I suspect that was people tuning in from a point of view of, I just wonder how they're going to do this.
Yeah, I suspect that's right. Anyway,
yeah, Piers Morgan made sense, except it's almost impossible within a bureaucratic organisation like the BBC to basically establish those rules around political reporting and opinion on Twitter or in other places.
Really, the way to manage that is just to have people in the organisation who manage people and say, look, I think you've sort of gone a bit too far with that. Just wind it back a bit.
Well, you know what you end up with, Jack? You end up with a small army of people who are overseeing, for example, ABC employees on Twitter.
No, you don't need a small army of people. You need one person who every now and again keeps a bit of an eye on it.
No, I don't think it works that way, mate. I really don't think it works that way. So you end up being, supervisory. I mean, this is part of the problem with the ABC is that their management that revolves around the oversight of their editorial policies is just so enormous. There are just so many savings to be made by cutting a lot of those people adrift. Anyway, we'll move on because one of our favourite letter writers, Farmer Lawrence, we can call him Farmer Lawrence because that's what he does for a living, wished to respond to your outrageous remarks about Dutch farmers, Jack. He sent me a bit of a link, which I'm happy to post on our Facebook page because it really is very good, and it shows a different side to this farmers' protest. I'll just read the letter first, Jack. But Lawrence really knows what he's talking about in this respect. So he said, I've got some views re Belgian and Netherlands farmers' protests. First up, primary ingredient in nitrogenous fertiliser is natural gas, hence the steep rise in prices in 2022. There are other ways to make it. They require bigger inputs of energy than gas, so there is talk about carbon neutral nitrogenous fertiliser, though through either nuclear or green hydrogen, but it's some time away yet. Yes, legislation enforcing reduced use of nitrogenous fertilisers and reduction of cattle numbers is being sold as a climate change measure, but there are other reasons for it. Drinking water. Ooh. Europe's streams, rivers, and even underground water sources are being loaded up with excess nutrients. Plants don't use all the nitrogenous fertiliser applied in a growing season. Nitrogen fertiliser efficiency when growing grains is around 70 to 80%, but this drops below 50 when growing grass for animals. The unused nitrogen moves down into tile drains under the farmland, put there to stop waterlogging of the plants above. From there, it goes into drainage ditches, then into local watercourses. The peri-urban challenge. The Flanders region in Belgium is a little bit bigger than the city of Sydney. It has 1 million more people, 500,000 cattle, and 5.5 million pigs. So that's a lot of people and a lot of animal manure. Great fertiliser, but spreading it on farms creates odour issues for urban centres. It also adds to nutrient loads, both nitrogen and phosphorus, when it's washed off into streams. Strict rules have been applied, so it is worked into the soil and in some cases injected deeper, but then you have the same problem of nutrients coming out of the bottom of the system into watercourses. Final personal thought, Lawrence says, it's a bit rich for EU farmers to be protesting government intervention when the same government's intervention locked competitors out of their markets while contributing around 50% of their income in direct payments for decades.
And still does.
And it still does, of course. A nice little swipe there at the end. But yeah, Lawrence is talking about this. The link that he posted to me, which I read with great interest, sort of indicates that these aren't, and the protest has been portrayed as a small farmer battling against the might of bureaucracy and government, when really it's driven. The protests are driven and encouraged and supported and funded by some of the largest agricorp companies in the UK, in Europe and around the world. So very interesting, and an alternate take there. I did notice in the piece that Lawrence sent through that there is, in that piece, it was expressed as fact rather than opinion, that it may well be that Europeans have to eat less meat, and that's when we get to a problem, don't we?
Yeah, people are very fond of doing this or that for the environment until it comes time to losing money or changing their lifestyle.
I think that's a good response to that. Yeah, so it's not just about climate tyranny, Jack. I think it was called. There's been a few signs up about climate tyranny. I saw some idiot tweeting about the Dutch farmers, Dutch and Flemish farmers, without having any understanding that this actually you'll get a lot more angry people if they can't drink the water. Put it that way. All right.
Well, you need to make the case that's going to happen.
Well, I think we just basically heard it, that you've got way too much nitrogen and phosphorus, and that it is leaking into the water systems now. And the history of this is just that. And so the Dutch, at least, or the Dutch government have actually tried to sit down with their farmers, and due to support from the big corporations, the big agricorps, they've gone no. So there was a negotiation there. And now that's led to sort of a legislation. Yeah. Interesting stuff. And I'd recommend our listeners do a bit of reading about it, because this has been cast perhaps unfairly as small farmers fighting against the man, when really it's a little bit more complicated than that. Net zero and the global race for new green prosperity, almost a contradiction from what I've just been talking about, Jack.
Well, I was just amused. This is Rachel Reeves, who's the Shadow Chancellor in the UK. She's a Labor MP, obviously. And this is a common theme that political parties carry on with all around the world. And this is her. There is a global race on, and despite all our promise and potential, Britain is falling behind. Labor will change that. Our green prosperity plan is vital for getting our economy growing so we can lead the pack again. Britain can win the race for the jobs of the future. Labor's green prosperity plan will bring back our world-class car manufacturing. God, she must be old. To build electric vehicles here and bring back good jobs to our industrial heartlands. This could be Chris Bowen. Everyone's always talking about the global race. We've got to be first to do all these green things without ever really thinking them through.
But there are, I think a lot of those people, that we can call them climate agnostics, if we like, Jack, climate change agnostics. A lot of that opinion revolves around just completely ignoring the opportunities in employment and enriching your economy of these ways. What we did see, and haven't seen profoundly yet, is that motor vehicle manufacturing in the UK, a lot of it down in the south of the country, it's essentially manufacturing parts. I mean, the vehicles will be assembled, whether they're Holden or Ford, they'll be assembled ultimately in countries like Romania. The difficulty is with Brexit, Jack, is that makes it very, very difficult to get those parts into that place where they're finally assembled into one whole vehicle. So they've got problems with the UK. I don't think they'll ever really overcome Brexit as a handbrake on their economy. It will be for a very, very long time.
Well, the car manufacturers, I don't think, agree with you. There was always talk that they would shift their manufacturing out of the UK, and they haven't. In fact, it's growing there. I was just wondering how old
businesses aren't.
No,
don't tell me the businesses are growing. They're not growing. It's a tolerable state right at the moment, but it really only just needs some logistics planning from some of the major motor vehicle manufacturers, and that just cuts them out. And that's because that's where the pressure on supply is.
Yeah, well, there's certainly talk of more investment. I'm just wondering how old she is, because she can remember a time when the UK had a world-class car manufacturing business. I don't know when that was.
Haven't you ever driven a Wayland, Steve? Yeah. What was it, PT-76?
P-76.
P-76, yeah. Mate of mine used to play a lot of cricket with him. You'd see him coming from miles away. You could just hear it, the Wayland, and then the windscreen used to pop out. You'd have to put it in with a bit of chewy gum on the side. It just used to pop out, and that apparently was a feature. Yeah, all right. Not their highest point, but they Rolls Royce are pretty much based there, Jack, and they do a pretty good line in aviation engines and what have you.
Yeah, and Jaguar used to make great cars, but you had to buy two. You always had one in the shop getting repaired.
Although if you buy a roller, it'll cost you an arm and a leg just to put some air in the tyres. Vietnam, we've been looking at Vietnam as an industrial hub and a growing one, Jack. But there's some political problems all there at the moment.
Well, the president's been pushed out on an anti-graft crackdown. He and his family were involved in $175 million procurement order for test kits at the height of the COVID pandemic that allegedly spurned the embezzlement of millions of dollars of state money. So he's been pushed out, because just like in China, the real power resides with the General Secretary of the Communist Party. So no one really knows at this stage whether this is a genuine statewide, countrywide crackdown on corruption, or whether it's a political play to get rid of a rival. What it has led to is a slowing down of investment and development, because nobody in the bureaucracy wants to sign off on a decision in case it's later found to have been a dodgy one.
Talking about your handbrakes. So 175 million procurement of COVID testing kits, Jack. That doesn't sound like an overwhelming amount of money. 175 million is a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but if you're providing, I would need to know how many of these kits were being provided and just how much money that might have been taken off the top.
Yeah, how much was skimmed off the top.
Okay.
So it'll be one to keep an eye on. It's early days yet, no one's really quite sure.
Yeah, look, as we say, as we've been saying now for weeks, Vietnam is perhaps best placed to become the next big manufacturing hub for the world.
And foreign direct investment still happening.
Yeah, and that will happen. But if you have these sorts of political impediments, these sorts of hurdles, that will slow it all down.
Investors like certainty.
Indeed they do. Didn't we just say that earlier on? No, that was President Xi Jinping, Jack. You've taken a note out of his book, but he's absolutely right about that. Now we move on to sport, Jack. The Border Gavaskar Trophy has been won by the Indians 2-1. Series just wrapped up last night with a draw in Ahmedabad. Pretty good game, actually, for a draw. Did peter out probably in the last couple of sessions when Australia didn't look like they were going to lose any wickets in a hurry. And we did also notice, and the Indian team were noticing very, very closely too, because there was an outside chance that Sri Lanka would make the final of the ICC Test Championship, provided they beat New Zealand 2-0. And in the first test there, it went right down to the wire with New Zealand winning by the last ball of the day. I don't know if you saw it. Williamson scattered. There was a ball, probably should have been called a wide. Short ball bowled at him, and he and his batting partner, I think it was Wagner. Wagner ran to the keeper's end, and Williamson ran to the non-striker's end. The throw hit the stumps, and he was home by about half a metre, and that gave them the win. The Indians were watching all of this. I don't know if they had it on the board. They must have, because they all started shaking hands with one another, knowing that that meant that they would be playing in the ICC Test Championship. Australia assured its place with its win in indoor.
Which I think it's at the Oval this time, right?
It is at the Oval. I've been saying Lords, so I do apologise. I just presumed it'll be at Lords, and it'll be at the Oval, which is a different track. It will suit India's spinners, but Australia have got a few now too. You know, we lost 2-1. Probably it's being reported today. Lost in about an hour's worth of cricket at Delhi, where they just threw away their opportunities. But we found out a fair bit about our current crop, and then there's a fair bit to be excited about with some of the new players that have come in. Todd Murphy is a ready-made Test player now. And I don't know if you saw him bat with Nathan Lyon. When they put on 80, he got 50, and I just looked at his stats, and from Victoria, I think his top score was about 20 odd, and he averaged 8. But of course, he'd only played 7 games, so we just had no idea. And he might have played pretty good country cricket with the bat, because he's playing square drives, pull shots. You know, he looks like he's got a fair bit about him. So that's one they've definitely picked up.
Kuhneman looks okay. Looks a ready-made cricketer as well.
Absolutely. We've also seen Nathan Lyon's reputation as well. Is he the greatest of all time? The GOAT of off spinners. He's certainly the largest wicket taker from oppositions in India now, having overtaken Derek Underwood. I think. We've also learned a fair bit about Travis Head. He got 90 yesterday. She probably should have gone on and got a ton. Played a fairly big drive to Axiyalev and got our clean bowl. But I think we found a good opener there now too. Uzi Khawaja did not bat, did not open, did not bat at all. Seems to have a bit of a calf problem, Jack, and that's a worry. Man of his age.
Yeah, they don't tend to get better very quickly.
They take a while. If they ever get better. I just thought it was a terrific series, and I think with you take 1 hour of really bad cricket out of Australia's performance on that whole tour, and I think it was pretty much even Stevens. And the Indian side, of course, are great.
The other thing that's been missed, I think, in the coverage of it, is that the Indian quick bowlers were much better than ours. I think Shami's an outstanding bowler. In the first 2 tests, he took 7 at 14. Only bowled 30 overs and took 7 wickets at 14. And our blokes, there's a reason for that. The Indians are skiddier bowlers, which works better on their tracks over there. That's no doubt about that.
Wasn't a lot of reverse going on throughout the whole series. Shami's a hell of a good bowler. His bowling in Ahmedabad was outstanding. He was easily the pick of the Indian bowlers in the first innings when Australia did knock up a big 400. Very flat deck. But hell of a good player. Look, we were missing Hazelwood. We were missing Stark. I don't think Stark is suited to those conditions at all.
No.
I would have liked to have seen Scott Boland bowl a little bit more, but really, once they'd settled on the selection of the 3 spinners, I think that made sense.
I think that worked. Here's an interesting stat for you. In the last of India's 7 home series, their fast bowlers have collectively averaged below 21. In each of those series, the opposition quicks have averaged over 35.
Yeah, look, the only thing I'd say about that is that they really didn't come up with a second seamer. So Shami was and they've got the great bloke out injured at the moment, but second or third seamer seems to be a little bit elusive for them.
Yep.
He's a very good player, but I don't know that he's as good as, let's say, Hazelwood. Good series, and we can't wait for. They go now into a one-day, and I think best of three there. Cummins is back for that and will lead Australia out there. I have a look at someone like Marnus Labuschagne. I think I don't know that he's going to be playing the one-days. I don't think he's that sort of player now.
No.
We'll see. But that's coming. That starts on Thursday. Also starting, Jack, on Thursday night is the Blues and the Tigers kicking off the AFL season. It can't come soon enough, can it, really?
Gee, I thought the AFL done a really good job. Every one of those matchups in the first round's a beauty.
They do really get... It's not as if they pull them out of a hat anymore. They really do.
No, they
just
don't.
line them up, don't they? Who else have we got there, Jack? Besides that, I only really care about the game on Thursday night. Everything else is just nothing to me. But who else we got?
Who else we got? We've got the Cats and Collingwood, North Melbourne and West Coast, Port Adelaide and Brisbane, Melbourne and the Bulldogs, Gold Coast Suns and Swans, Giants and the Crows, Hawthorn, Essendon and St Kilda and Fremantle. And I know you've just been logging onto your footy tipping thing, and you're going to have your work cut out with that.
Yeah, if you get 5 or 6, you're going okay.
Yeah.
Give me one tip, Jack. Who's going to be your wooden spooner this year?
Who's going to go worst? I think Hawthorn or North.
All right, I'll give mine a St Kilda, a side that should be doing a lot better, and I just think they're not particularly well.
Well, I think Hawthorn are going to have to get worse before they get better, and probably North a little bit the same.
Yeah, I think that's right. I just have a feeling, I may not be completely wrong. Some people have tipped St Kilda to make the 8, but I just think they've left good management out of their system for a long time. In rugby league, Jack, the Dolphins are 2-0. They beat the Raiders. That makes me laugh. The coach of the Raiders there, he won't be happy. He's always complaining about something. If they ever get beaten, it's the refs
He's never happy, is he?
Ricky Stewart. He was complaining in the first round that one of their players was called off with the concussion rule, and he said, I should be able to make that decision. I mean, fair dinkum.
No.
Fair dinkum, Ricky, no. No, mate, you don't make those decisions. So the Dolphins beat the Raiders. Ha ha! I'm not a fan. They beat them 2014 at the KO Stadium. It's a 10,000-seater in Redcliffe, Jack. Purpose built, and it is just for your benefit. Next to the Dick Tosser Turner complex. I don't even know what that is, but
he was the former player who used to be on the media, wasn't he?
Dick Tosser. It seems to be some sort of sailing outfit, but I don't know.
No. Tosser Turner was used to be on the media.
Oh, okay. All right. Tosser Turner.
I think so, anyway. Yeah.
Our listeners will correct us, I'm sure. The Storm were thumped by the Bulldogs, who in turn were thumped the previous week. So it's pretty hard working out form while the Roosters away got their first win, beating the Warriors 2012, and their season is now officially underway. And Jack, just finally, quite seriously, there was an awful fall at Flemington on Saturday. High-profile jockey Jamie Carr remains sedated and in critical condition. And Craig Williams also had a fall. He's being operated now for a broken shoulder, and he suffered concussion as well. It's just, I don't want to get into the whole business of, racing's too dangerous and this and that and the other, but it just tells you just how hard that job of being a jockey must be. You're riding around about 1,000 pounds worth of animal, and you're basically sitting on a cigarette paper.
Yeah. Jamie Carr's talking to the family now, so they've pulled her out of the sedation. So
Excellent. Well,
that's
that is
good news.
The last report I read was not as happy as that one. So that's excellent news. Now, Jack, take us out.
Look, there were two things that caught my eye this week. Was first of all involves the possible Trump indictment, and one of the wags on Twitter said this: instead of resorting to failed 90s style tough on crime politics, we should address Trump's law breaking with job training, affordable housing, and mental health services.
That's a real cynical view. Can I just remind, I hope that fellow's listening, can I just remind that Donald Trump took out a full-page ad in the New York Times urging the execution-style punishment of a group of black men who'd been allegedly involved in the rape and murder of a woman, and that turned out
in Central Park.
Yeah, in Central Park, and DNA, of course, rendered them innocent. Yes, I would be going out to
And the last thing was, I know you're really keen on electric vehicles, and there's still at the moment a shortage, probably able to be overcome, but a shortage of electric vehicles charging stations.
Yeah.
And there was some chaps in Georgia who did a robbery, and their getaway vehicle was a Tesla.
Yeah.
And unfortunately for them, it ran out of charge about 5 or 10 minutes away from the scene of the crime, and they were unable to recharge it. So they were scooped up by the wallopers.
Oh, well, look, there you go. There's another benefit to electric vehicles there. Yes, they jumped in there. Look, can you just wait half an hour while I just get a charge into this thing? Yeah. Look, it is a bit of an issue, and Tesla drivers are actually saying, look, every time I go, or indeed any EV, because Tesla have their own charging units and they don't allow, or perhaps they're not capable of handling other vehicles and so forth. And you do see a lot of Americans, I see this on Instagram, sort of complaining that there'll be all of this sort of infrastructure, there'll be all these charging stations, but only half of them work, and then other people will just park there overnight and charge their vehicles overnight, so it's actually quite difficult to get in. And that brings us to the end, Jack, unless you've got something else. I noticed there's something pretty interesting going on in Germany here, Jack.
Oh, this was I forgot about that. In Berlin, they've announced that the water park and the public pools there are now going to allow women not to wear tops when they're bathing.
They'd be topless bathing.
Be topless.
Well, men have been doing it for a long time.
Yeah, and that's exactly. And the best comments on that was, first of all, finally equality.
Yes, I agree.
And
fantastic.
And some young man, I thought perhaps even topped that with "Ich bin ein Berliner."
There you go. I think today we're
rehashing the JFK.
I think we're all the winners today. Excellent work, and I think a great achievement for progressivism around the world. Thank you for joining us today, Jack. You've been terrific. You've hung in there. Your voices just made it through the program. I hope you avoid the dreaded 2 lines on the COVID test kit later on today or perhaps early tomorrow. Thank you for your time today.
Cheers.
And thank you to our listeners. And we just want to ask you, if you want to get in touch with us, please do. We deal with all our letters. We try and get them into the program. We've got another one sitting there from Ray. We haven't forgotten about you, Ray. We'll get to you next week. And so, yes, you can get hold of us through the Conditional Release Program Facebook page. You can get hold of us that way through instant messaging, or you can get hold of me on Jack the Insider, on @JackTheInsider on Twitter. My DMs are always open. And Jack, you've got your...
Oh, you can find me on Substack. There'll be something else posted up there tomorrow if I stop coughing.
All right, there you go. Thank you, listeners, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.
Cheers.